little bit about me. So Managing Director of ORBIT RRI Limited. The reason I highlight that is that this spin-out company actually came into existence just this week. So yeah, it's a newly minted not-for-profit company, which is a spin-out from De Montfort and Oxford universities, and its role is to provide training and consultancy and maybe a bit of research into the academic but also commercial market, innovation markets. My background, I'm an engineer by training, a systems engineer, but quite a lot of background in commercializing, well, doing research in technology, but also commercializing that research as well. In terms of what ORBIT actually does, well, we provide training courses to centres for doctoral training mainly. So there are, I think, 71 or 72 of those across the UK, funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And all of those centres for doctoral training require their students to have formal responsible research and innovation training. So, and they work on a wide range of disciplines, from artificial intelligence, health data sciences, advanced manufacturing, functional coating, cybersecurity, a very wide range of statistical machine learning, water treatment, offshore wind farms, the alternative power generation. The list is pretty endless, but the common thread of all of those is that all of these technologies they're working on will potentially have a very big impact on the world in the future, and the RRI part of the taught elements of their courses is really intended to get them to consider the implications of their work in the future. So that's what ORBIT is really all about. We're also developing courses in ethics by design. We've actually trial delivered one of those already, and we are beginning to deliver courses on PAS 440, which is I'll be talking to you about today. So it's a bit about me and a bit about ORBIT and the newly minted not-for-profit company. So what is responsible research and innovation? I'll start with that really. It's a bit of a background, bring everybody up to speed on that topic, and then we'll talk a bit about how that relates to responsible innovation, and in particular how we manage the transition of a technology from the research environment through to the commercialization environment, which is I think quite a rocky road for many researchers in particular. That commercialization play is always tough. So let me just play you a short video which talks about responsible research and innovation.
Scientific research is one of the main contributors of innovations that change the world we live in. Still, there is room to revise the social contract between science and society in order to shape a future more tuned to the needs and expectations of the citizens. You, as a researcher, and the institution you work in are key players to reach this goal. Responsible research and innovation provides a framework for a renewed contract between science and society. RRI is about building stronger connections with society to answer its needs more easily. It means, for example, making your research more open, transparent and accessible to others. It means thinking in a more inclusive and diverse way, a willingness to embrace perspectives from other fields and take on board a wide range of ideas. It means always considering the gender dimension in research and innovation, promoting gender balance in teams and in decision-making bodies, and improving the quality and social relevance of the results. It means trying to anticipate the impacts of innovation on society and adapt accordingly by increasing flexibility and reflective thinking. At the end of the day, RRI may lead to a more problem-oriented research, the opening of new research avenues, and the possibility.
Okay, slightly stop short there, but anyway. So that gives a general introduction to RRI, what it's really about. Sorry, sorry. Okay, so what do we actually mean by this? Well, RRI for ICT research really means that it may be that the research that we're undertaking in academic institutions or indeed in industry isn't necessarily motivated, at least initially, by a very clear end product. So as a result of that, we don't really know where the technology is going to end up, how it's going to be used, how it might be applied with other technologies to create different kind of outcomes. So that's one particular issue. The other issue is that I think one of the things we're seeing certainly recently is the increasing speed of idea through to development. One of the characteristics of what they're calling the fourth industrial revolution is the speed of flash to bang of idea through to implementation. And so the speed of change can be problematic because the ethical dimensions may not necessarily be the thing that we are focusing on when we're rapidly innovating a technology. However, we may be concerned about these things going on, but at the same time, we don't really want to stifle technology. There's a great deal of need for innovation. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there are many things there that humanity at large is concerned about, and technology, to a certain extent, could solve some of these issues, or at least contribute to their resolution. So we don't really want to stifle technology at this point, or indeed any time. So we also need to think really about a way of including researchers and connecting them with the wider community. And that's obviously quite difficult when you don't necessarily have a clear end product to your research. It may be quite difficult to communicate the nuances of a technology which is at a very early stage. I was involved with many others in public engagement exercise on quantum technologies, quantum computing, quantum communications, and quantum sensing, and dealing with we had the great honor of dealing with a significant number of members of the general public, and it's really quite hard in some cases to communicate the merits of these technologies when sometimes the outcomes are not necessarily that clear. It's a bit easier for sensing technologies and for the quantum navigation technologies, and to a certain extent for the communications technologies as well. You can talk about the sort of cybersecurity aspects of quantum key distribution, for example. But when you get to quantum computing itself, the benefits in terms of optimization, or protein folding, or drug research, or whatever, seem somewhat far off and are in themselves fairly abstract. So actually really engaging with the wider community so they can better understand what we're doing is really quite difficult at an early stage. And ultimately, even if we do that as researchers, we're not necessarily in control of how our technology is taken forward once it moves over into a commercialization phase. So I think there's a very worthy set of activities here. I think this is all incredibly worthwhile, but I think we do have to seriously think about how these activities and these insights that we might gain during the research phase survive once the technology is commercialized. And this is what PAS 440, I think, is really, at least to a certain extent, about. So another video here. So I'll just talk about one of the frameworks that we use in the UK in particular for undertaking responsible research and innovation around technologies. It's quite a comical one. It's from the FRICT project that was run a number of years ago. Let me just play the video now.
The Framework for Responsible Research and Innovation in ICT project, FRICT. Imagine interacting with your very own robot. You're preparing breakfast in the kitchen one morning, and in comes the robot. "Good morning," it says with a smile. "Morning," you say grumpily. It looks at your face, tunes into the tone of your voice, notices smoke rising above the stove, and hears you slam a pot into the sink. Quickly, the robot works out that you are not having a good morning at all. Because this robot is an emotionally aware robot, it can change its behavior according to what it notices about you. It can guess your mood from your posture, your tone of voice, the color of your face, your heart rate or breathing pattern. The information helps it interact with you in a more natural way. So if you're having a bad morning, it can avoid upsetting you further and can even try to make you feel better. This kind of robot is an example of an effective device. Effective devices are designed to perceive, interpret, or express emotions like we humans do. But while there are benefits to this kind of technology, there are serious considerations too. Like, where does the robot store your emotional profile? And who has access to it? Insurance companies? Drug companies? Future employers? And what if the robot becomes so good at expressing and responding to human emotions that it confuses people? What if people begin to treat the robot like it's a fellow person? And how would we feel if these systems misinterpreted our behaviours? Would we feel deceived? How would this affect our sense of control over the technologies that play a part in our daily lives? Our work explores how we can make innovations in digital technologies that are mindful of the consequences for individuals and society. To do this, designers of technology should make their best efforts to anticipate the consequences of their innovations, reflect upon the problem they're trying to solve, engage with all those who have an interest or are affected by the innovation, and act to ensure the innovation is socially desirable. By studying the positive and negative impacts of computing devices and factoring them into the design process for future innovations, research communities become more accountable both to those that fund their work and to the public in general.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the framework that's been adopted by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council in the UK, and it's certainly part of what we do in Orbit. So, but the question is, of course, what happens when research is commercialised, when companies are spun out, when research is licensed out to third parties? In that case, can commercial interest override societal concerns? Well, of course they can. They don't have to be, of course. Many companies have a very strong societal ethic about them, but that certainly can happen. And of course, these things are complex and nuanced as well. So obviously in a commercial company, you do have a strong motivation of creating shareholder value and competitive positioning and all that kind of thing. And that will obviously is one of the main motivators and objectives of commercialization. And so they may have that interest over and above others, for example. Equally, the idea of protecting intellectual property discourages, or can be seen to discourage, deep engagement, particularly for breakthrough technologies or things that are seen to be highly disruptive. And if you want to bring something to market and you want to gain market share quickly, then a great deal of engagement in advance that gives the game away may be problematic. I'm sure it can be done. I'm sure it has been done. But the protection of IPR is obviously something that the company has to keep a strong eye on as well. We have seen a number of technology leaders, people like Tim Cook from Apple, who've expressed a strong preference for self-regulation rather than formal regulation, particularly around the time there was a lot of concern about overuse of smartphones, and when the screen time applications came along. They expressed a strong preference for self-regulation. They felt that the industry should regulate itself rather than waiting for regulatory bodies to step in and legislate against certain types of behaviour. So self-regulation obviously is a good thing if it's effective, but it may always also be seen as delaying some problematic aspects of the implementation of the technology as well. And ultimately, if a technology, creates unemployment or creates divisions in society, whose problem is it anyway, really? If the company's gaining market share or whatever, then is that not a broader issue? Is it one particular commercial organization's problem to actually address these issues or to identify these issues? Well, many would say yes, or at least partially. And I think most companies would at least agree that they are living in the society that they are serving, but it may not necessarily be all their problem. In fact, it almost certainly isn't. So these are the kinds of issues we need to consider when we commercialize our research. So PAS 440. So PAS is a publicly available specification. This was a document that's actually been published by British Standards Institute. But it was actually created by a team of academics and industry, supported by Innovate UK. And this was a document that was released, I think, back in April of this year. It's freely downloadable. If you're willing to share your details with them, you can download it for free. And we have been told by Innovate UK that this, of all the PAS documents that they have supported and created, this one has been downloaded far more than any of the others. So their feeling is, or certainly initially, that there's a lot of interest in how responsible innovation for industry can be achieved. So apparently a very good response to the release of this document. So it's really intended as a way of helping companies to manage or to implement responsible innovation right through from development, you might say TRL level 6, so a prototype in a representative environment, through to TRL 9+, which is commercialization, and then clearly iteration and modification ongoing. So as the standard itself does take into account multiple iterations of a technology, which obviously is quite well aligned with things like Scrum or Agile development processes as well, which we see quite a lot of in software engineering. So it seems to fit quite well with that, and really gives a path and a process for managing responsible innovation activities across the technology life cycle. So that's its real intention, and it's intended to try and embrace the needs of a wide range of stakeholders as well. So what it also does, and I think this is incredibly important, is to try and build a business case for responsible innovation. I mean, as a commercial company, you do have to consider where you're spending your money, and is it being applied for the best benefit of the company itself and shareholders and other things. But obviously with the interests of broader society taken into account as well. So, but it is actually making or attempts to make a strong business case for responsible innovation. So it really talks about the idea of identifying risks with the technology. So for example, if there's a problematic aspect of a technology that causes regulation to be brought in, you may, for example, consider the case of drones, for example, who there were issues earlier this year or last year in terms of them impinging upon airport perimeters and having an impact on air navigation. And so, you know, one might reasonably say that by putting geofencing or some mechanism within drone technologies could mitigate the risk or at least reduce the liability of a company. At least they took reasonable steps to prevent incursion on airport perimeters, for example. So that might be a way of identifying a problem and then mitigating that risk, which is clearly commercially beneficial. So also, I think there's a concept now of the idea of investors actually looking for more ethical homes for their money. There are you know, responsible investing and ethical investing, and this could very much form part of that, to demonstrate a corporation's commitment to social responsibility, particularly with their more advanced innovations. You might also say that it could actually be a way of attracting staff. Yeah, there have been a number of cases. You may be aware of Google with the Maven project, which was a computer vision project that was analysing video from defence drone systems, and the engineers that were working on the Maven project actually wrote an open letter saying, when we came to Google, we didn't come to work on defence projects, and we're not very happy about working on those projects. And Google did actually drop the contract, and I believe some of the employees also left as well, because they didn't really want to work on defence projects. So there clearly is there are a number of cases of where working for an employer, particularly if you have a particularly rare skill set, you may be attracted to an employer that shows stronger responsible innovation credentials than others. And equally, those attributes go through to the brand. If you're a parent buying technology for your children, then it may be that you look for those brands that have a strong association with social responsibility, but also responsible innovation. So we have a number of examples of where there's data to support that, but clearly it's something that's evolving over time. So the attempt here is really to build a strong business case for responsible innovation, because it costs money to implement. It may, of course, create a much greater return than what it costs, one would hope so, but nevertheless there's an upfront cost associated with implementing such procedures. So yeah, and also just more broadly to think about broadening out innovation capabilities, looking at those broader opportunities, and to create new products and services. Particularly if you're in the app development business, it may be that there's opportunities there for mitigating some risks introduced by other companies' less responsible services. So the creation of new markets, for example. So yeah, again, further cases for the implementation of responsible innovation in industry. So there we go. So in terms of an overall structure, let's just talk a little bit about what PAS 440 has, the way they've addressed this. So first of all, they've really tried to look more broadly at the corporation, the company, and its organizational behaviors. What they've tried to do is to sort of say, well, as an organization, does it actually embody the is it actually that concerned about its corporate social responsibility? Does it actually show behaviors that tend to suggest that it is indeed a good custodian and also a good citizen as well? So there's an organizational element to this, which is reviewed across the organization and is not aligned to any particular technology or innovation, but it's more broad than that. However, it also, as a methodology, looks at the responsible innovation aspects of individual technologies. So as a technology goes through its development life cycle, it looks at risks and benefits across a number of categories, and we'll go into those in a moment. And what PAS 440 tries to do is to bring the two together. So it looks at organizational behavior, organizational competence, as it were, and corporate social responsibility, alongside innovation-specific measures, looking at the impacts, benefits and risks of individual innovations. So it looks at it very much in the round. So in terms of company level responsibility, they've chosen to go down the route of ISO 26000, which is the corporate social responsibility guidelines. So that's not an auditable standard, but there are a number of things in there which are seen to be business beneficial, but also socially desirable. So looking at the broader economy, obviously ethical behavior, things around transparency in decision making, obviously respect for the rule of law. One would hope as a good citizen we would all do that, and obviously things like respecting human rights. Of course, there are a wide range of definitions of what that means. So this is what CSR is really all about.
Let's talk about CSR, corporate social responsibility. What exactly does it mean? Global warming, diminuted natural resources, the extinction of various animal and plant species, global population increase, and migration. Amongst others, these are some of the real environmental and social issues we face today. How can we address these issues whilst ensuring food, education, and health for all? How can we ensure that economic development and technological progress benefit the greatest number of people? Faced with these challenges, a more sustainable, developmental approach becomes necessary. This requires the commitment of all international organisations, governments, associations, companies, citizens. Everyone is concerned. And in practice, what can a company do? The overall goal is to combine economic progress, social justice, and environmental preservation. Based on its corporate social responsibility, a company can ensure that its economic growth is beneficial to everyone: its suppliers, employees, customers, the local population, in short, all its stakeholders, whilst minimising its impacts on the planet. Depending on the sector of activity, the specific issues and challenges differ from company to company. Let's take a pharmaceutical company. It can act responsibly in many ways. For example, offer to as many people as possible safe and quality medicines, take into account the needs of patients by supporting them throughout their healthcare. And for all companies, being responsible also means taking care of its employees and ensuring their safety at work. It also means being compliant with the application of the various laws and regulations, as well as defining ethical business practices. It also means reducing the environmental impacts of its production sites and choosing less polluting modes of transport. Thus, the ambition for a responsible company is to contribute to an economically efficient, socially equitable and environmentally sustainable development whilst ensuring its profitability and economic growth. As such, corporate social responsibility, CSR, is now recognised as a real performance driver, particularly because it encourages innovation, reduces costs, and brings employees together around a meaningful project. Within our daily activities, both individually or collectively, we can all be part of this evolution, and that's what's really inspiring. And at Servier, CSR is a conviction, resulting in concrete actions implemented with enthusiasm.
So these are the kind of issues that are to be considered, and that's something that there's a very large body of work on ISO 26000. Many people have said over the years that when economic times are difficult, these kinds of standards become unpopular because they're not necessarily core business. It'll be interesting to see in the recession that we are in or about to join now whether these kinds of issues become less prevalent or not this time around. That will be an interesting piece of work to do in the future, so whether CSR falls by the wayside when times become difficult, but we will see. So yeah, again, these are the kinds of issues very much around the broader kind of corporate behaviours. But in terms of PAS 440, so corporate social responsibility is very much part of it. But in terms of looking at individual technologies and innovations, what it tries to do is it actually gets it asks the person doing the innovation or leading the innovation to maintain a register of risks and benefits across societal, environmental, health, supply chain, and regulation. And I think one of the key elements of this, which is really important, is in fact that it's an iterative process. So for example, if you were at TRL level 4, which is a small scale prototype, what you know about the society, so TRL being the technology readiness level, I apologize. So if you were at that level of development of a technology, the implications to society may not necessarily be that clear. It may be that at that point you don't know what the broader implications are, maybe you do. Environmental equally so, health equally so. Supply chain, you probably have some idea, because that will form part of your cost model. And regulation, I'm sure you'll be keeping a weathered eye on regulation to see if something's coming along. But as that technology progresses through different levels, maybe as it moves on to TRL 6, which is a small scale prototype in its representative environment, you should know a lot more about the supply chain side. You have a very good idea because you most likely using the components. You'll have a pretty good idea about the regulation that's in place. Whether you know what's coming, of course, is another matter. From a health perspective, you will clearly have needed to evaluate its impact on the health of users and others from a legal regulatory perspective, but maybe more broadly. The environmental impact in terms of recycling, there would be a need to provide some sort of recycling information if this is something that's going to be sold in an environment that requires that. Clearly, there are exceptions to these things. We've seen examples like some of the military aircraft, for example, that have had radar absorbing materials that have turned out to be or were always highly toxic, but it appeared the performance outweighed the risks associated with the toxicity. So we've seen examples there in certain environments, and the broader kind of societal issues of the technology. But as it progresses through the stages of development, the standard requires you to update your register, looking at these different areas, both from a risk and a benefit perspective, in order to clarify your thinking and to maintain a register of that, alongside, of course, as a corporation, acting in a corporately responsible manner. So this is the register. These are the societal benefits, societal risks, environmental benefits and risks, health, value chain elements, and regulatory elements as well. So regulatory, I guess, being looking at current regulations to see whether you comply, but also really trying to look into the future to see whether new regulation is likely to come in, which obviously is a very good business move anyway, because you don't want to be building a product that then gets regulated out of use, or indeed regulations change or relax so that you can actually have a broader application, so it can work both ways. So that's the basic structure of PAS 440. You demonstrate your corporate social responsibility, and then you look at each iteration of your technology and you maintain a register of risks and benefits across all these categories. So that's the general idea. This is a kind of table this is actually from the standard itself, and this is a kind of table that you're required to keep. But obviously, once made aware of these issues, and I think this is one of the main reasons why they actually require ISO 26000 style corporate social responsibility, is of course once you know that once you predict that there are societal risks, environmental risks, and what have you, as a company or as an organization that espouses CSR type aspirations, you should really then do something about it. I think that's really the idea, that you've actually maintained this register, you've iterated this, you've updated it as you've gone, and your CSR stated CSR agenda should require you to then try to address these issues, which I think that's a pretty smart approach. Obviously, this is a very new standard. It remains to be seen how effective this is, but I think in terms of a particular approach, so it isn't just around, they could very well have just gone down the route of maintaining what is effectively a benefits and risk register, but that on its own doesn't necessarily do too much for the world. The organization may record this, they may have a register of it, and then it goes nowhere. But of course, if the organization is committed to broader social responsibility, then being made aware of these issues, it certainly gives it at least a moral obligation to then try to address those concerns that they have identified. So I think putting those two things together, I think, is a pretty smart approach. So that pretty much sums up what I'm going to cover for PAS 440. I've given you kind of a high level overview of what responsible innovation is, how we look upon this in industry, how PAS 440 has chosen to interpret and make a business case for this this approach. Just to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Orbit in relation to this. As I mentioned, we do a lot of training in responsible research and innovation for researchers, but of course many of the issues that get identified through those processes will manifest once technology becomes commercialized, once it's actually out in the world. That's when they'll reach scale, when they'll be deployed broadly, and so therefore the integration, or we are looking to try to integrate how research frameworks and industry frameworks effectively work together. So because you have research frameworks in responsible innovation, we talked about the area framework, and there are others. We've talked now about an industry framework, PAS 440, but how does one manage information across the boundary between those two frameworks? So for example, if there are issues around societal impact of a technology identified during the research phase of a project, how do those make their way into the commercialization phase of that technology? How do they survive that transition from a research environment to a commercial environment? Is there a form of documentation? Is there some sort of register? Is there a way of ensuring that issues that were identified in the research phase make their way into industry and they are addressed one way or another? Who takes that responsibility? And also, so aspects such as what documentation might be passed across should research be licensed out. So as I said, we've just spun out as a company. We have licensed research from the universities. So what obligations should come with the licensing of academic research to make sure that those licensing the research take the responsible research and innovation aspects of the research seriously and actually follow through on what was identified during the academic phase of the research. So that's what we're looking at. Also looking at things like obligations required from licensees. Would we actually require them, for example, or should a university require a licensee of technology to then actually apply things like PAS 440 in their research activities, in their commercialization activities rather? So again, it's pretty early days for this. We're just thinking about it now, about how that might work. But the idea is really to come up with some sort of end-to-end approach to ensure that things identified through all the very worthy work that's going on in academia now on responsible innovation actually survive the re-entry into the commercial world and actually make those issues are identified and hopefully addressed as products actually reach scale and indeed deliver the hopefully very positive impacts that we are all expecting. So that's it from me now. I'll open the floor to questions if anybody has any questions about